The wind bit with a cruelty reserved for the heartless months of January, its icy fingers sweeping across the moors as if to remind the world that winter did not forgive weakness. Outside the tall, frost-kissed windows of Ashbourne Manor, the snow fell in relentless sheets, muffling the footsteps of those who dared wander the estate grounds. Within the grand ballroom, however, warmth glimmered in abundance. Gilded chandeliers scattered diamonds of light across polished oak floors, and the scent of waxed wood mingled with faint perfumes of lilac and rosewater. Yet, even amidst the glittering throng of society, a shadow of unease lingered, an invisible tremor that pulsed whenever the name of Lady Eleanor Whitcombe was whispered behind gloved hands or pressed lips. She sat at the far end of the gallery, a figure swathed in a muted cloak of deep sapphire, its velvet fabric clinging with a damp chill to her shivering frame. Her hair, a cascade of chestnut waves, fell loosely about her shoulders, and her eyes, those wide, stormy eyes, darted with the vigilance of one accustomed to censure. In her arms rested a small bundle, wrapped tightly in a threadbare shawl, the fragile proof of a life both miraculous and scandalous. The newborn's faint cries punctuated the murmurs of the ballroom, an unintentional herald of the disgrace that seemed to follow her like a persistent shadow. The whispers began as a murmur, almost imperceptible. She should not be here. Such impropriety, in the Duke's own presence, no less. A child born in secrecy, how dreadful. Lady Eleanor's fingers tightened around the bundle, and she drew a slow, shuddering breath, as if inhaling courage from the air itself. She could feel the sting of every gaze upon her, the curious, the disapproving, the thinly veiled amusement of those who considered her plight a spectacle. Her cheeks burned, not with fever, but with the raw fire of humiliation. She was aware, with a clarity that made her chest ache, that she had become a cipher in the eyes of polite society, a woman reduced to whispers and conjecture, her worth measured in the scandal of her circumstance rather than the quiet grace that had once defined her. It was then, amidst the crystalline clink of crystal and the faint rustle of silk skirts, that he arrived. The Duke of Ashbourne, Lord Nathaniel Hawthorne, entered the room with the measured precision of a man accustomed to command. Every step resonated with authority. Every glance carried the weight of judgment tempered by discernment. He paused at the threshold, his eyes, a shade of stormy gray that mirrored the gathering clouds over the moors, sweeping the room before settling on her. In that instant, the ballroom seemed to contract, the conversations fading to a distant hum as though the world itself bent to the gravity of his attention. Lady Eleanor's heart stuttered in her chest, a fluttering bird trapped within its cage. She dared not meet his gaze. The shame that had nestled in her bones for months now rose like a tide, threatening to spill. And yet, in the depth of her fear, there was a fragile spark of hope, the faintest whisper of relief that perhaps he alone, would see her not as a spectacle, but as a woman still deserving of dignity. The Duke's gaze lingered, perceptive and unyielding, but unlike the others, it did not mock. His eyes searched, discerning not just the scandalous circumstances, but the truth beneath, the exhaustion, the terror, the fierce maternal instinct that pulsed through her very being. The chatter of the ballroom continued, a symphony of polite cruelty. Servants exchanged glances behind their masters' backs, and distant relatives muttered in hushed tones, some feigning concern, others savoring the taste of whispered judgment. Lady Eleanor felt the weight of each passing second, the unrelenting pressure of society's eyes, and she tightened her shawl about her child, as though to shield them both from the world's prying scrutiny. Her lips trembled, and a single, suppressed sob threatened to escape. She pressed the child closer, inhaling the faint scent of new life, a scent so pure, so defiant, that it seemed almost an affront to the whispers that sought to diminish her. A sudden stir rippled through the crowd. The Duke moved forward with deliberate calm, his boots silent upon the polished floor, yet every motion commanding attention. He approached her with the kind of certainty that both unsettled and captivated, the hush of anticipation growing thicker than the velvet drapes that framed the room. Lady Eleanor's pulse quickened, a tumultuous rhythm that betrayed her resolve. She was aware of the scandal her presence might provoke, yet she did not flee. There was, in her exhaustion, a quiet defiance. If the world would judge her, let it do so. She would not vanish into the cold shadows, not when life itself clung to her arms with such tenacity. The Duke halted mere paces away, his tall frame imposing yet not overbearing, the faint scent of leather and smoke mingling with the warmth of the room. His voice, when it came, was low and controlled, carrying the resonance of authority tempered by empathy. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his tone neither scolding nor indulgent, but precise, deliberate. "You do not belong in such desolation." Her eyes lifted then, meeting his gaze for the briefest of moments, and in that instant, the tumult of fear and hope collided. The whispers of the ballroom dulled to a mere murmur. The frosted windows no longer seemed so cold, and for the first time in months, she felt the fragile stirrings of relief. If she did not speak, words would betray her, reveal too much of the desperation that clouded her. Instead, she pressed her lips together, clinging to the small warmth of her child and the weight of dignity that still, miraculously, remained. The Duke's gaze softened, perceptive and unwavering. He extended a gloved hand, an offer of silent assurance rather than intervention. Lady Eleanor's fingers brushed against his briefly, hesitant yet electrified by the contact. The sensation was fleeting, but it carried with it the promise of something unspoken, a defiance of judgment, a refusal to let shame dictate her every breath. Outside, the snow continued to fall, relentless and pure, a silent witness to the small yet monumental act of connection that had just occurred. Within the ballroom, whispers persisted, yet their sting was dulled by the presence of a man who saw her not as a subject of gossip, but as a soul in need of recognition, of compassion, and perhaps of protection. Lady Eleanor exhaled slowly, a mixture of fear and fragile hope coursing through her. For the first time since the birth of her child, she allowed herself a thought she had thought impossible. Perhaps she would not face this winter alone. But even as a tentative warmth filled her chest, a tremor ran through her limbs. The cold had seeped deeper than mere wind or snow, reaching the very marrow of her exhaustion. Her knees buckled beneath her, and the child stirred with a sharp, frightened cry. The Duke's hand was there instantly, steadying her, gathering both her and the newborn with care that was almost reverent. A hush fell over the ballroom once more, a collective breath held in suspense. The whispers had paused, the judgments momentarily suspended, as all eyes turned to the tableau before them. A woman, frail and shamed, and a man, tall and unwavering, standing sentinel against the cruel eyes of the world. Lady Eleanor's vision blurred, not from tears alone, but from the weight of her circumstances pressing upon her. Yet, in that blurred vision, there was clarity, an understanding that life, though harsh and unyielding, had offered a reprieve in the form of this single, steadfast presence. She clung to the Duke's arm, not merely for balance, but for the fragile thread of hope he represented. And though society continued its silent judgment, though the ballroom still pulsed with the undercurrent of gossip, a quiet, unspoken pact had been formed in the fleeting instant of their contact. The child's soft, trembling sigh mingled with the muffled murmur of the gathering crowd. The Duke's eyes, still fixed on hers, held a question unspoken and yet profound. Would she allow him to guard her against the storm of both snow and scandal? Lady Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, her resolve teetering between fear and the audacious hope of salvation. Outside, the winter winds howled, but within that gilded hall, the first ember of something tender and irrevocable had been kindled. And then, as if the very world sought to test her, the child whimpered again, tiny and fragile, and Lady Eleanor's knees faltered completely beneath her, threatening to collapse into the cold marble of the floor. The Duke's arms were there before she could fall, lifting her and the newborn with a care that seemed to defy both gravity and judgment. The ballroom stilled. Even the chandeliers seemed to flicker in recognition of the fragile, perilous moment. It was in that suspended heartbeat of fear and fragile hope that Lady Eleanor realized the world might not yet have finished its cruelty. But perhaps, just perhaps, she had found a defender who would refuse to let her go. The morning after the ballroom incident arrived with an unrelenting frost, the landscape of Ashbourne Manor draped in a dazzling, almost cruel perfection. Snow clung to the branches like frozen lace, and the sun, pale and tentative, glinted off icy rooftops, casting a cold light that did little to warm the soul. Lady Eleanor remained secluded in her chamber, the newborn cradled against her chest, her trembling hands tracing the soft curve of his cheek as if memorizing the fragile life she had fought so hard to preserve. The events of the previous night lingered in her mind, a mixture of humiliation and something else, something that quickened her pulse whenever she recalled the Duke's unwavering gaze and the weight of his hand when he steadied her. A soft knock at the door startled her, delicate yet purposeful. Before she could speak, the door creaked open, revealing a servant who bore a small, elegantly wrapped parcel. "For you, milady," the man said, bowing slightly, though his eyes lingered with the hint of curiosity that marked all who served the Ashbourne estate. Lady Eleanor's fingers, still chilled from the window pane she had pressed against moments before, trembled as she untied the ribbon and peeled back the delicate paper. Inside lay a scarf of the richest azure silk, its fabric impossibly warm, and atop it a note in the Duke's precise, elegant hand. "May this shield you from the frost as you have shielded your child from the world. I will not let the winter claim you, nor shall it claim your courage." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a fleeting instant, the shame that had pressed so heavily upon her shoulders felt almost bearable. The gift was modest, almost painfully so, but in its simplicity lay an intimate gesture that spoke louder than any declaration of intent. She drew the scarf to her face, inhaling the faint scent of cedarwood and tobacco, the Duke's personal signature, and felt a shiver of connection run through her, a tether between their disparate worlds of restraint and longing. The morning passed in a blur of ritual and quiet observation. From her window, Lady Eleanor saw the Duke riding across the estate grounds, his figure cutting a solitary line through the endless white. The snow swirled around him, and yet he remained resolute, a sentinel against the bitter winds that mirrored her own vulnerability. The whispers of scandal, however, were not so easily silenced. Letters arrived with the insidious precision of a winter storm, inked in delicate hands that carried the poison of polite judgment. Friends she had once trusted now regarded her with suspicion. Acquaintances whispered of impropriety, of circumstances that society would not forgive. And yet, in the midst of this quiet tempest, the Duke's attention remained steadfast. He visited her chambers under the pretext of necessity, checking on the child, delivering messages from distant relatives, but in his measured pauses, his steady gaze, and the subtle, almost imperceptible touches of reassurance, he conveyed more than words ever could. Each gesture, a silk-gloved hand brushing a stray lock of hair from her brow, a gentle adjustment of the newborn's blanket, a soft nod of acknowledgement, became a silent dialogue of protection and emerging trust. By afternoon, the chill of the room had been replaced by the warmth of an oil lamp, its light flickering across the folds of her modest drapery and the soft fabric of her gown. A knock again drew her attention, and she found a second token waiting, a small silver locket, etched with delicate filigree, containing a tiny portrait of the manor under winter's snow, a reminder that even amidst judgment, the world could still hold beauty. The note attached was simple, almost uncharacteristically vulnerable. "This is for your strength, which surpasses all the whispers of a cruel world. Guard it well, as you guard your child." Lady Eleanor's fingers lingered over the locket, her chest constricted by a sudden ache of longing and gratitude. Each token, each note, each deliberate act of kindness from the Duke stripped away some measure of her fear and humiliation, replacing it with something tender and precarious, a sense of being seen, being valued, beyond the cruel lens of society. The weight of shame remained, yes, but now it was tempered by the possibility that she was not entirely alone, that perhaps someone of courage and discernment could recognize worth even where the world saw scandal. Yet, the whispering shadow of society's judgment remained relentless. A servant, tasked with tidying her room, lingered too long by the window, eyes darting toward the snowy grounds where the Duke had ridden that morning. "Milady," the young woman murmured, "there are those who say the Duke visits you for reasons most improper." The words, though tentative, struck sharper than any snow-laden gust. Lady Eleanor's hands tightened on the locket, the fragile smile she had permitted herself vanishing like mist. She rose then, folding the silk scarf carefully about her shoulders, and approached the window, her gaze searching the expanse of white where the Duke's figure had disappeared. The winds tore at her cloak, flinging her hair across her face, yet she remained poised, her silhouette a delicate contrast against the blinding whiteness of the world outside. In the distance, she glimpsed a shadow moving, tall, deliberate, unyielding. A part of her feared it was an agent of gossip, or worse, a witness to her frailty. Yet, instinctively, she felt another truth, one that set her heart thrumming with anticipation. The shadow moved with the precision, the purpose, and the care of the Duke himself. The hours stretched thin, and Lady Eleanor's resolve hardened, a fragile flame flickering in defiance of the chill that seeped through both walls and heart. She clutched the locket and scarf to her chest, inhaling courage and determination with the same measured care she gave to the child at her breast. The tokens of the Duke were more than mere objects. They were promises, silent and steadfast, that amidst the frost of both society and season, someone remained willing to shield her from harm. And then, as the wind howled against the panes and the baby stirred in his slumber, a sharp, distant sound fractured the quiet. The unmistakable crunch of boots against the snow, deliberate and measured, drawing closer to the house. Lady Eleanor's heart skipped, a potent mixture of fear, hope, and unspoken yearning tightening her chest. She moved toward the window, peering through the frost, and caught a glimpse of the familiar figure once more, emerging from the storm as if carved from the very landscape itself. The Duke had returned, not merely as a shadow in her memory, but as a presence that could no longer be ignored, a steadfast sentinel in the white, merciless world, bearing the unspoken promise that he would not let her falter, nor would he allow the whispers of scandal to claim what remained most precious. The drawing room was a sanctuary of warmth against the relentless winter beyond its tall, frost-veined windows. The fire crackled, spilling golden light across walls lined with books whose leather spines bore the scent of age and quiet wisdom. Lady Eleanor sat in a high-backed chair, the newborn cradled carefully against her chest, and for a moment, the world outside, the whispers, the scorn, the endless scrutiny, seemed suspended in the dancing shadows. The Duke of Ashbourne stood across the room, his tall frame partially illuminated by the firelight, a presence both commanding and careful, as though each motion was measured to soothe rather than startle. Her voice, when it came, was a fragile whisper, hesitant yet urgent. I cannot seem to escape it, even here," she said, her gaze tracing the flickering patterns upon the rug. "Every glance feels heavy, every word behind my back a knife. My own family, my friends. I am left bare to their judgment." The Duke's eyes, gray and penetrating, softened as he took a careful step forward, his boots silent against the polished floor. He did not speak at once, for he knew the power of silence, the weight it bore when shared between two hearts encumbered with fear and longing. He finally said, low and deliberate, "You are not alone in this, Lady Eleanor. Though the world seeks to define you by scandal, I see you as you are, a mother, resilient, brave, and dignified, even when the world deems otherwise." His words were precise, Victorian in their restraint, yet laden with an intimacy that caused her chest to tighten. She dared not meet his gaze fully, for fear that her vulnerability would betray itself in trembling lips or tearful eyes. The room smelled of wood smoke and candle wax, of the faint perfume that Lady Eleanor had applied with trembling fingers that morning. The child in her arms stirred, a soft, plaintive cry that echoed the tension in her own chest. She shifted him slightly, whispering a lullaby, a melody that had been passed down through generations, and the Duke observed quietly, noting the meticulous care she lavished upon the fragile life she had born into a world both harsh and unforgiving. There was a pause, a shared breath between them, as if the very air in the room conspired to allow a moment of unguarded truth. "I fear," she murmured, her voice catching, "that no matter what I do, I shall never escape the weight of their eyes. I am unworthy of peace, of love, perhaps even of happiness." Her confession, so raw and unembellished, hung between them like fragile glass, shimmering yet perilously close to shattering. The Duke stepped closer, the firelight reflecting in the sharp planes of his face, and extended a hand, not intrusive, but tender, a bridge across the chasm of her shame. "Unworthy," he echoed softly, the single word carrying both incredulity and reverence. "Lady Eleanor, it is precisely because you have borne what others fear to acknowledge, because you have protected and nurtured life in the face of cruelty, that you are worthy, not merely of love, but of every measure of dignity the world seeks to deny you." His tone, formal yet intimate, brushed against her defenses like warm silk against chilled skin. She felt the thread of hope stirring, tentative and delicate, within the confines of her heart. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to look fully at him, to observe the lines of weariness beneath his eyes, the subtle tension in his shoulders, and the quiet compassion that tempered the authority of his presence. Each measured gesture, each carefully weighed word, was an unspoken promise of protection, of steadfastness against the relentless tides of gossip and judgment. She realized, in that slow and aching revelation, that the Duke's attention was not capricious, nor was it born of mere curiosity or obligation. It was deliberate, a quiet insistence that she, and the child she cradled, would not be abandoned to the frost of society's cruelty. Her fingers tightened around the child's tiny hand, the warmth of life anchoring her to the moment. "And yet," she whispered, voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear, "what if the world refuses to forgive us? What if your kindness cannot shield me forever?" The Duke's eyes, shadowed yet resolute, met hers with unwavering certainty. He stepped still closer, closing the distance without a single word, and allowed his hand to hover near the child, an offer of care that transcended speech. "You are stronger than you know," he said at last, his voice low and deliberate, "and stronger still than the world believes. I cannot shield you from every whisper or every glance, but I can offer this. While I stand, neither you nor your child shall know abandonment. That, Lady Eleanor, is my promise." The words, simple in construction yet monumental in meaning, hung in the room, echoing against the walls lined with the history of generations. She felt her heart swell, a tide of fragile hope pressing against the shores of her fear, and for a heartbeat, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps the winter could be survived. The newborn stirred again, small cries punctuating the intensity of the moment, and the Duke's hand moved with delicate precision to adjust the blanket, brushing a gentle thumb against the soft cheek of the child. The act was intimate, protective, and eloquent in its silent declaration. He was present, unwavering, and utterly attentive to the fragile lives in his care. Lady Eleanor's gaze met his once more, and she saw the weight of restraint in his expression, the conflict between propriety, social expectation, and an undeniable pull toward her. And in that shared, silent acknowledgement, she realized the truth she had long sought to deny. She did not face this world alone. A bridge had been built, wrought of empathy, admiration, and the quiet insistence of a man who would not allow shame or circumstance to dictate the fates of those he chose to protect. Yet, just as her chest eased with the warmth of connection, a faint rustle from the hallway stirred her senses, a reminder that while a sanctuary existed here, outside its walls, the world continued its vigilance, and the next intrusion might test both her courage and the fragile bond that had begun to take root. The storm had grown fierce by the evening, snow lashing against the manor's stone walls as if determined to batter the world into silence. Within the warmth of the drawing room, the fire roared higher, casting flickering shadows across the polished wood and the rich tapestries that lined the walls. Lady Eleanor stood near the hearth, the newborn nestled safely against her chest, her gaze following the patterns of flame as though seeking courage in their erratic dance. The wind outside howled like the chorus of a world impatient with propriety, and in that restless tumult, her heart thudded with an unease she could no longer ignore. The Duke entered without announcement, his tall form outlined by the glow of firelight, yet carrying a presence that was far from silent. Every step was measured, deliberate, a rhythm that spoke of authority and intent alike. Lady Eleanor felt a shiver not from the cold, but from the proximity of him, from the magnetic weight of his attention pressing gently against the confines of her guarded heart. "You remain vigilant, even in the warmth," he observed softly, his voice a baritone that reverberated against the walls, rich and unyielding. There was no judgment in it, only recognition, a mirror to the resilience she had borne silently. Her lips parted, but she spoke only in fragments, hesitant and raw. "I cannot bear the thought of their scorn. Even now, it follows me, whispers in every shadow." And yet, her voice faltered, trembling beneath the weight of fear and something far more dangerous, hope. The Duke moved closer, bridging the distance in 2 long strides, and in the movement, the firelight caressed the sharp planes of his face, illuminating both weariness and unwavering resolve. "I am no stranger to whispers," he said quietly, letting the words sink between them like stones dropped into still water. "Nor am I blind to the cruelty of polite society. But know this, I will not permit them to dictate your worth, nor the life of this child." His eyes, gray and penetrating, searched hers with an intensity that left no room for pretense. Every glance, every measured word, seemed to carve a sanctuary around them, a space in which scandal held no dominion. Lady Eleanor's fingers tightened around the shawl that swathed her child, the fragile pulse of new life grounding her amidst the storm and the intensity of his presence. And yet to defy them, to defy all that is expected, it feels impossible. "Even your kindness, sir, cannot shield me from their judgment forever." The Duke knelt slightly, lowering himself to the level of the child, and allowed his hand to hover near the tiny fingers, brushing them with a gentle reverence. Each gesture spoke of guardianship, of devotion beyond words, and the unspoken weight of protection settled over her like a mantle of warmth. "You presume the world's cruelty will bend me," he said softly, yet with the certainty of a man accustomed to command. "It will not. The moment you or this child are threatened by gossip, by scorn, by the petty tyranny of society, I shall intercede. I shall stand where they would condemn, and in my presence, your dignity shall remain unassailable." His hand, steady and confident, found hers, fingers brushing against hers with a touch that was firm yet reverent. Lady Eleanor felt her chest constrict, a blend of fear and exhilaration tightening around her ribs as the reality of his devotion pressed upon her. The wind rattled the windows, snow flurries dancing like ghosts against the glass, yet inside, a rare stillness settled. She dared, finally, to meet his gaze fully, noting the restraint in his expression, the careful balance between propriety and desire. Every inch of him spoke of measured power, of a resolve that would not falter in the face of judgment or scandal. And in that recognition, a seed of courage took root, fragile yet insistent. Perhaps she could surrender, even if only for a heartbeat, to the possibility of love. The child stirred, tiny cries echoing in the room, and the Duke's hand adjusted the shawl once more, his thumb tracing a gentle, protective line. Lady Eleanor's lips quivered, her voice a soft murmur. "You would claim me, even as they would condemn?" The question, so small and tentative, hung like crystal in the heated air. The Duke's eyes softened, the storm of his emotions restrained yet present, and he leaned closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "I claim you, Eleanor, not in defiance of propriety, but in assertion of what is true. You and this child are not to be left at the mercy of idle whispers. I will not let them dictate your fate, nor mine. My claim is not for society to witness, but for us to endure, and it is absolute." His words struck like a bell through the quiet chamber, resonant, irrevocable, leaving no space for doubt or denial. Her heart thudded, a wild, desperate rhythm, as the gravity of his declaration settled upon her. In the flickering firelight, she saw not only his strength, but the vulnerability of intent, the delicate truth that he risked everything, reputation, expectation, propriety, for the sake of her dignity, her child, and the fragile embers of hope now glowing between them. The snow swirled outside, relentless and pure, a mirror to the tumult of emotions within the room. Lady Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she realized the world's cruelty remained unyielding, the storm unceasing. Yet here, within these walls, a sanctuary had been forged by presence, by words, by the weight of an unspoken, unwavering promise. She clutched her child closer, her eyes meeting the Duke's once more, and in that gaze, she felt the first true pulse of courage, that even amidst scandal, the harsh judgment of society, and the blinding cold of winter, love, unyielding, defiant, and resolute, could take root. A sudden knock at the heavy door startled them both, sharp against the roar of the storm. The child cried, a plaintive wail that echoed through the room, and Lady Eleanor's pulse leapt in tandem. The Duke's hand remained firm upon hers, yet tension coiled in the air. Someone had come, and whatever waited outside might test the fragile bond they had just forged and the declaration he had so courageously offered. The morning broke in fragile shards of light, pale and trembling against the frost-covered windows of Ashbourne Manor. The storm had spent itself overnight, leaving the world glazed in silver, each branch and rooftop glinting like crystal. Lady Eleanor stood near the hearth, the newborn resting against her chest, her cloak of deep sapphire brushing the polished floor. The air carried the crisp scent of snow through a half-open window, mingling with the warmth of firewood and candle wax, a contrast as delicate as her own resolve. Outside, the estate grounds lay silent, vast and untamed, and within, the quiet tension of anticipation lingered, threading through every heartbeat. The Duke entered without ceremony, yet his presence filled the room as though the walls themselves had shifted to accommodate him. His eyes, storm-gray and unwavering, swept over her with a mixture of admiration, longing, and the iron resolve that had become so familiar to her over these past days. "The world waits, Eleanor," he said softly, but with an authority that allowed no question of his intent. "They will not forget, nor forgive easily, but we're no longer bound by their approval. Today, we claim our own path." Her fingers tightened over the child, the warmth of new life anchoring her against the swell of fear and hope. "And what if they rise against us?" she whispered, voice fragile as frost. "What if our defiance brings ruin instead of reprieve?" The Duke's lips curved in the faintest, deliberate smile, and he stepped closer, the heat of his presence brushing against the chill that still lingered around her. "Let them whisper," he said. "Let them frown, speculate, and condemn. I have chosen to shield you, Eleanor. I have chosen you. The rest is inconsequential." He extended his hand, not in command, but in invitation, and she found herself trembling at the simplicity of it, the profound weight of its promise. She rose, placing the child carefully in his arms. His hands, steady and protective, cradled the newborn with a reverence that silenced every doubt in her mind. The sight, the two of them, life and hope held in his grasp, stirred something fierce within her, a courage born of recognition. That love, when truly unwavering, could withstand even the harshest judgment. They moved to the drawing room's central window, where the first rays of the winter sun spilled across the glistening grounds. Lady Eleanor's eyes followed the expanse, noting the distant figures of servants beginning their morning duties, the faint traces of footprints in the snow. Society had yet to arrive, yet the world's scrutiny remained an invisible weight, pressing even upon this fragile domesticity. She leaned lightly against the Duke's shoulder, inhaling the faint scent of his coat, leather, tobacco, and something indefinably his own, and allowed herself to trust in the protection he had so steadfastly offered. "The whispers will not end," he said quietly, his voice a low anchor in the warm room. "But neither shall my presence falter. You will not face them alone. You and this child, you are mine to guard, and I will honor it without hesitation." His hand brushed hers briefly, a gesture of quiet authority that carried more intimacy than words could bear. Her heart thrummed, each beat a drum of fear, relief, and something profoundly tender. A sudden movement outside drew their attention. A distant figure approaching along the snow-laden path, gloved hands raised in greeting. Eleanor's breath caught. Her pulse quickened at the possibility of exposure. Yet the Duke's steady grip on her arm anchored her to courage. He moved forward, carrying the child, and with a simple, deliberate motion, opened the front door. The visitor, a relative whose disapproval had been a constant shadow over recent weeks, paused, taken aback by the sight before them. The Duke of Ashbourne, resolute and unyielding, standing with Eleanor and her child at the threshold, unflinching and entirely composed. The relative's lips parted, words of reprimand poised, but the Duke's voice cut through before they could form. "Eleanor Whitcombe is under my protection," he stated, formal and absolute. "Whatever judgments you wish to pass are yours alone. They will not touch her dignity, nor the child she cradles." His tone left no room for argument, and for the first time, Eleanor felt the invisible weight of society lift, just enough for her chest to expand with relief. She stepped forward then, the silk of her gown brushing the threshold, and met the Duke's eyes fully. You have done this for me," she whispered, awe and gratitude threading every syllable. The Duke inclined his head slightly, a subtle acknowledgment of the bond they had forged, one tempered in scandal, yet reinforced by courage and unwavering devotion. The child stirred, small fingers curling around Eleanor's, then the Duke's, and the warmth of that connection, the three of them bound in fragile, defiant unity, was electric in its simplicity. Outside, the snow glimmered like diamonds, the storm spent, but its echoes lingering in every shadow. Within the manor, a quiet triumph had been won, dignity reclaimed, love asserted, and a future, however uncertain, now claimed in the unyielding presence of devotion. Eleanor's breath caught as she realized the full scope of what had occurred. She was no longer simply surviving. She was being seen, protected, and cherished. The Duke's hand moved to brush a stray lock of hair from her face, fingers lingering with gentle insistence. And in that single gesture, the fragile threads of hope became unbreakable. She felt the tension of months dissolve, replaced by a pulse of courage and exhilaration that coursed through every vein. And yet, even in this triumph, the world waited beyond the threshold. The snow-draped moors stretched endlessly, a reminder that trials were never fully past. Eleanor's gaze met the Duke's, and in his storm-gray eyes, she saw both promise and challenge. That together, they would face whatever came, but only if she allowed herself to trust fully and irrevocably in the man who had refused to let her go. The door closed softly behind them, sealing the warmth, the light, the fragile sanctuary they had claimed. The child nestled between them, and for a heartbeat, all fear, all whispering judgment, all scandal seemed distant, inconsequential. Yet the last flicker of snow against the window pane reminded Eleanor that this was not an ending, but a beginning, a defiance of cold, of cruelty, and of the world itself. And in that realization, she allowed herself the smallest, most audacious smile, knowing that at last she had found her anchor, her sanctuary, in a love both daring and unyielding.